Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from KOAN Sound, Led by Ancient Light. Alright, KOAN Sound. This is the well-acclaimed Bristol duo of Jim Bastow and Will Weeks, returning with their sophomore album. This technically is not the first time I've covered these guys. Way back in 2020, I did a Some Stuff I Missed segment on their debut album, Polychrome. Even though I was 2 years late to it, there was still such an overwhelming demand from fans to check it out, and I had seen requests for it any time I covered any more, complex neuro-adjacent artists or expressed my enthusiasm for the modern strain of, EDM and IDM blends pushed by labels such as Upscale, among others. It was always them and Culprate that repeatedly kept getting brought up to me. When I did eventually check them out, I was really surprised by just how big their cult following really was, and how many artists I was already a fan of, like Frequent and Hudson Lee, and even Amon Tobin and Hybrid and Disclosure were following them. A lot of those newer talents in that whole upscale scene would often talk about KOAN Sound as a big inspiration for them. Real, producers' favorite producers. Having looked into this duo's history more since then, I did eventually start to get where their reputation came from. While full albums from these guys aren't exactly a common occurrence, again, this is only their second, they have been around since the end of the 2000s, putting out loose tracks and EPs. They got their start in that late 2000s dubstep scene, right as that genre was starting to transition from its more chill UK roots into the more commercial and aggressive sound that really blew up everywhere in the early 2010s. They definitely contributed to that more aggressive side of the genre, and especially when they were briefly signed to the Outlaw label in the early 2010s, putting out EPs like Funk Blaster, Max Out, and The Adventures of Mr. Fox, delivering some of the better produced blends of those electro house and 2010s dubstep sounds around at the time. As the years went by though, their sound started to go in a progressively more atmospheric and abstract direction as they put out EPs like Dynasty or Sanctuary in collaboration with Asa, starting to see more comparisons to outfits like Noisia over the more Skrillex and Feed Me adjacent stuff they started on. Eventually breaking off Outlaw to start releasing independently on their own Shoshan label, and all of that finally culminated in 2018 when they released their above-mentioned debut album Polychrome, when pretty much all of the commercial dubstep sounds they cut their teeth on had all but gone away in favor of pure sound design experimentation and chilled-out atmospheric synth funk and glitch hop mixes, very much in the same vein as an artist like Tipper. I pretty much stand by all the thoughts I gave on that album when I covered it in the Some Stuff I Missed segment. I immediately understood on first listen why so many people were specifically asking me to check it out and talk about it, and I did think it was a great album. The sound design was predictably excellent, and it certainly had a little bit more of an easier to connect emotional core than most of Tipper's more recent efforts over the last decade, such as Forward, Escape, and Jettison Mind Hatch. Though Polychrome was only barely crossing that threshold of greatness, mainly carried by the particularly strong 4-track stretch at the very end, maybe even just the last 2 tracks, if I'm being honest. And again, like those Tipper albums, it did still feel like an album where making the sound design as cool as possible was taking higher precedence over the emotional core. And having heard as many albums in that exact vein as I had, I couldn't get as enthusiastic about the sound design for its own sake as I might have wanted to. Also at the time, I think the tagline on their official Bandcamp page was saying things like they were the future of electronic music, which I guess was technically true, but made them feel a little overly pretentious and self-important and instilled a more skeptical mindset within me. Great album for sure, just not one I felt the strongest need to keep around or come back to a lot. I admittedly had not been following the duo that closely since then. They have been putting out more EPs, including a quick one-off release on Noisia's Vision Recordings label in 2021. But it wasn't until they started releasing singles from this new album and eventually announcing it that they started to draw my attention again. The full album dropped a few weeks ago and had an entire short novel to accompany it, which you can currently read for free on their website. Kind of a sci-fi concept about a colony in space living next to a red giant star about to die, 2 retired military vets going out to find one of the guy's daughter who they thought was dead, coming across elemental spirit beings made of fire or something, and eventually reuniting with the daughter and facing the end of the world as they know it together. pretty heavy stuff. Immediately reminded me of what Coma Duster did with Solace back in 2017. KOAN Sound's story is way more direct and easy to follow than Coma Duster's was, although with Coma Duster it was clearly coming from a way more personal place and was a lot more symbolic for his own feelings and mental struggles he was going through. This story feels like the guys just wanted to write a bunch of cool sci-fi set pieces with neat imagery and string them together in some kind of big Blade Runner 2049 or Interstellar-inspired epic. But the story is obviously just supplemental material. Even if the album cover seems to bill the album as an original soundtrack accompaniment to add to the story, an album like this isn't going to hit as well if it doesn't also work the other way around. The music out to be able to stand on its own, and I'm here to judge it as such. The album, completely removed from that context, has already been getting a ton of buzz from fans, and I've seen lots of various requests to cover it from commenters talking about how they think it's one of the best albums of the year. Now, I had already heard the album before I saw any actual buzz from the fans. I can't remember whether I specifically heard it the day it released, but I knew immediately on first listen that this was going to be getting a lot of people really excited. My first impression right off the bat is that, first and foremost, this is absolutely an improvement on their debut effort that even pretty directly addresses my biggest issues with it. Where Polychrome still sounded like the primary focus was purely to sound cool above all else, Led by Ancient Light does have an even more significantly present emotional core. Even before I read the story, I could kind of piece together what it was trying to be about through the music itself and the track titles. And it was pretty easy to pick up on those themes of loss, family connection, the end of the world, and all that stuff. They're able to translate all of it pretty directly to the tone of the music. And in terms of what it sounds like, it probably won't surprise anyone that this is pretty much just my kind of shit. Lots of intense, glitchy IDM and drum and bass mixes going up next to occasional vast down-tempo soundscapes, a few jazzier tones in places, and lots of orchestral touches with plentiful piano and string accompaniment on every track. The production and sound of the whole album is predictably phenomenal. Fans of artists on the Mesh label, such as Rob Clouth, Max Cooper, and especially Reed Willis, are really going to want to hear this. As for whether this is going to end up as one of my biggest favorites of the year, I'm not entirely sure yet. Like, this album may have addressed my issues with Polychrome, but it did come with its own set of separate issues. Most notably, I felt like this album ran together more than their debut, and a lot of these tracks sound very similar to each other without sticking in my mind as much as individuals. In that way, I don't think this hit for me as much as the actual Reed Willis album that dropped earlier this year, since that was better sonically varied and allowed its individual tracks to all have much more distinct and recognizable identities, while also hitting equally as deep an emotional note with equally impressive sound design. On top of that, there was a consistent sense I got from the album that the supplemental story came first and the music was directly written around it, which may have in itself led to that previous issue of tracks feeling less well-defined as individuals. To make the comparison with Coma Duster's Solace again, that was an album where it felt like the music came first and the story was written to service it, to add additional depth and detail and imagery that you technically didn't need to know about at all to get into the album and connect with it. Whereas Led by Ancient Light, true to how the album cover bills it, has more of the feeling of a soundtrack album meant to add on to something else. Something intangible feels slightly missing when taken by itself. Obviously not to say it's completely unable to stand on its own. It was still obviously designed as a regular album at the end of the day, and is still a great listen regardless of whether you've read the story or not. But I don't know, it maybe doesn't stand on its own as well as it possibly could have. Now, going through individual tracks, the album does certainly start out particularly strong. Embers from Chaos certainly makes for a fitting tone setter of an opener with all its layers of foreboding bass and rumbles going up next to pianos and strings. A ton of really nice build-up here and demonstrating to the listener right away the scope we're operating on and the level of sound design and emotional urgency you're going to get throughout the entire album, even if it definitely has more the feel of an album intro than a fully fleshed out track in its own right. The first proper track on the album, though, is Anchorite, and yeah, this one slaps. immediately heightening the build-up set by the previous track with a lot of the same cinematic mixes of instrumentation, going up next to a lot more skittering and slamming tribal percussion. While much of the track kind of reads to me as a pretty direct continuation of the intro, the track really starts to come into its own in the second half, where the pianos get a lot more rhythmic and the strings have a lot more of that frantic stabbing quality to match the percussion. I really like that whole part in the middle. Next is the album's lead single, Ascension, and this is absolutely the track I would have picked as the lead single if you asked me to choose one myself. It's one of the most well-defined tracks in the bunch, with a lot more like this modern drum and bass approach, contrasting all the frantic skittering percussion with a lot of serene string pads that have among the most striking lead melodies of any track on this album. Feels very warm and inviting, but also quite melancholy at the same time. And then that leads right into Voices of Dissent, probably the most experimental cut in the bunch, starting out with 30 seconds of building string arrangements, which are a lot more dissonant than any other previous track, and getting right into the intense IDM breakdowns. The track is nearly all percussion, with little melody aside from a bass line that develops in the last 2 minutes, but there's a ton of detail as the percussion switches between formless Confield-esque passages and more standard UK garage patterns, which kind of remind me of what Aleph did on his Ego Death album. And the way they go up against the chaotic string performances is pretty neat. Speaking of glitches, that leads right into Fragments, which kind of recontextualizes a lot of the abstract glitch work of the previous track into something a lot more stripped back. Nearly the entire first minute of the track very much lives up to its title, as it sends tons of little fragments of sounds past you each second, although it eventually culminates in the super sad and somber string passages to join all the crunching percussion underneath. And the album then takes a bit of an interesting turn on the track Liquid Levity, which is definitely the track on the album that most resembles what they were doing on Polychrome. It's a glitch hop track that combines a much jazzier set of piano performances with some more of the spacious string washes that color the rest of the album. As the title sort of implies, it does effectively act as like a lower stakes breather in the track listing, although certainly not undercutting the dramatic weight. Maybe not what I would have thought would stick out as an obvious single choice as they chose it to be, but it is certainly another one of the tracks here that I could most easily recognize whenever it came up. Then we get Interrogate, which brings back the UK garage beats in a big way, introducing some of the most classic burial-esque percussion patterns while combining them with more of the typical somber strings, although building into this really triumphant sounding burst around the halfway mark like there's some inspiring revelation of newfound hope. Fitting for the track, which corresponds to the moment in the story where the main character gets a verbal confirmation that yes, his daughter is in fact still alive. From there we move on to Kindred Void, the most peaceful track in the bunch that delivers nothing but lots of warm and comforting string pads and fluttering pianos. Despite being a track that I would often not easily notice in context, I do feel it makes for one of the deepest and most effective emotional moments for the album. But that takes us to the album's third single, its biggest centerpiece and probably the single strongest track in the bunch for me, Temple of Fervor. This track stretches on for a nicely meaty 7.5 minutes, combining even more of the cinematic string and piano performances and synth build-ups with more garage beats, and most importantly, this sort of like Asian flute melody that ends up becoming easily the lead melodic riff on this album that I'm most likely to be able to remember. The track, despite its length, is actually pretty straightforward and doesn't go on a lot of crazy detours, but the beats provide a very steady pulse and sense of forward momentum that never goes away. It can sometimes feel like what would happen if you combined a track from like John Hopkins' Immunity or one of the better tracks on Singularity with the kind of cinematic instrumental flourishes you might hear from a band like Hybrid. Which is also something you could say about a lot of other tracks on this album as well, but this is one moment where those comparison points feel the most apt. Now, admittedly, after this, we do get what I view to be the album's two weakest points. Exigence is a nice track that combines a lot of elements that worked on previous tracks, especially Anchorite and Ascension, and is equally able to convey that sense of danger through its dramatic strings and glitchy drum and bass adjacent percussion workouts. Although in context, it is definitely one of the least distinct sounding tracks and doesn't really introduce any new ideas that other tracks on this album hadn't previously. It is probably the track on this album where I would most frequently think to myself that the experience might be running together a bit too much. And then there's the title track, which in theory should really work for me, especially considering it corresponds to one of the most impactful parts of the story. Like in this part of the story, like the main character's friend who's been accompanying him the whole time, and is also a cyborg because, of course, He takes the time during this track to take, like, nearly all the machinery off of himself and be able to feel real human sensations thanks to those fire spirit things or whatever. It did really strike me as one of the biggest and most important moments when I was reading the story, although, ironically, the corresponding track on the album really didn't stick out to me much at all. It is nice as, like, this brief, almost purely ambient composition with, like, a little bit of choir and piano and little tiny rumbling glitch effects acting as minor accompaniment, and it feels way more pulled back and minimalistic than any other track on the album. I guess I can see how its more naked approach could fit for that moment in the story. Though it's not pulled back enough to be able to really stand out for its comparative subtlety, the sound palette was a little too close to everything else here, so in context it just ended up feeling like an ambient track that blended into the album too well and lacked a striking emotional height to make it stand out. Granted, if it's emotional heights I was looking for, the last two tracks are really able to deliver that. Embrace is a much more intimate string piece with a little bit of piano and glitchy percussion that clearly fits quite well for that moment in the story where the main character finally reunites with his daughter. Even if it borders on being an interlude, it was a moment that would always stick out to me for all its emotional catharsis. And the album finally culminates in the final track, Solace of the Red Giant, the longest and most emotionally intense track of all of them. In the story, this is obviously the moment where all three main characters have come to terms with the fact that the star they live next to is in the process of going supernova and they're all going to die within minutes. But at least they're all together while they're facing that inevitable end. And boy, were they able to match that tone in the music. The strings and other orchestral accompaniments have their most bittersweet and final-sounding melodic arrangements, and the entire track very slowly evolves into this post-rock noise piece by the very end of it. Not gonna lie, this ending did in fact have me tearing up a little bit pretty consistently. And that's everything on Led by Ancient Light. I think it's pretty obvious from all the unilaterally positive feelings I've expressed on the material here that I think this album is in fact something special. As far as artists in this scene making big sci-fi concept records with elaborate stories go, I think this might actually be the one where I got the most invested into the actual story and would most want to see, like, the imaginary movie they're envisioning here, even if the story is basically just a very straightforward amalgamation of a number of other existing sci-fi movies. It's still done well and got me to care about what was happening. I hope they continue to keep it up on their website even as they move into future releases or future album cycles. But this isn't a movie, it's an album. And the album, while great, does feel like it might be a bit too reliant on that supplemental story to work the best for me to say I enjoyed it as much as I really wanted to. I may enjoy all of these tracks if I take each of them in an isolated vacuum, but you really can't take them in an isolated vacuum with how tightly they all flow into each other to the point where they could almost be taken as a single 58-minute piece. And that tight flow can also sometimes work to the album's detriment, what with how the sound design and instrumentation is almost exactly the same through every track. All of them have very similar sounding string and piano performances, most of them have lots of glitchy beat work that fit very well into their already established sound. I can identify certain tracks on here, especially the ones that were dropped as pre-album singles. Even though I didn't listen to any of them before the album, they just stand out like that. And when I'm listening to them in order, it's not difficult for me to tell how far into the album I am from the sounds of the tracks I'm hearing. But if I were to put the album on shuffle, I wouldn't be able to tell nearly any of them apart from each other. Again, when they put original soundtrack under the title on the album cover and directly present it as secondary to the story, it's definitely not false advertising. That is in fact accurate to the manner in which this album seems to have been conceived. I'm just left wishing that worked more to the actual music's benefit. But still, even with all of those frustrations in mind, even if I have heard better albums in this particular vein, it's still impressive as hell, and definitely worth hearing and looking into. I'm not sure if it's one of my absolute favorites of the year. This has actually been a pretty dang strong year for electronic music. But I feel like it could probably notch an honorable mention at the very least. This is really freaking cool. I'd say it's worth checking out. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.